more or less on time. I enjoy being on time with things in this life. Being late has always annoyed me, and I'm here with plenty of tonight it's unnamed orange beverage rather than unnamed diet beverage, and I've also got some water as well. But I'm here. It is just after 7:40 Eastern Standard Time, New York City. I'm sitting here in Manhattan, and I'm going to have a conversation with all of you. So welcome. So glad that you're here. So glad we can have a late night conversation. Not late night, really. It's 7:40. Not too late. But welcome, everybody. Be sure to hit the like button. Be sure to hit the subscribe button. Be sure to hit the notifications bell. Be sure to tweet this out. Be sure to put this up on your Facebook and put this up on your Reddit. And be sure to cut and paste a link to this to go into your favorite Facebook chat group. Put this on WhatsApp. Put this on Telegram, put this on your favorite messenger app. I mean, bring more people. The more people we have here, the more fun. I didn't really get a chance to talk about it last time. We just had an amazing conference on the West Coast. It was amazing. And I met a number of you for the first time. Shout out to those of you that I met. It was really great to meet you. It's really great to see who's on the other side of the camera. I am sitting here. I can't see you right now. I have no idea who you are. I'm just staring at this piece of equipment, this iPhone. I'm looking at the lens. I'm trying to remind myself to look at the lens. And, but so many of you are just really, really great. We are a small community. We're not the biggest internet community. We're growing. We're growing pretty rapidly, actually. If you look at how big we were just a year ago, how big we were 2 years ago, we've been doing a steady upward trend, but we're a smaller community. So if you're here, it's because we have a bond. There's something about what we talk about here that's very special to you. We have something good. And you're from all over the world. You're from all over the United States, many different time zones. Many people watch this afterwards. They're not on here live, and we're doing great. I mean, we are a great community. So I value all of you. You are just as much a part of this as I am. You should know. I mean, I could, if I were just a guy talking, but it's our community that makes this happen. It's really, really special. And so I want to thank all of you. I want to just, let you all know about how exciting the community is becoming the Center for Political Innovation, how exciting it is to meet people who are ready to give their life to this, people who really believe in what it is that we talk about, people who have been longing for this kind of message. So many people say that they looked into the socialist movement and they were like, what? They liked the idea of socialism when they heard about it, but then they looked at the socialist groups and group after group and book after book. They were like, what? But now, they find this community, they find the Center for Political Innovation. They're like, wow, I've come home. This is what I was looking for all this time, they say. They thought socialism would be different. They were attracted to it on their own, but then they found this community. They found the city building tendency. That's what we are, folks. We are city builders. And they found the city building tendency. They found the Center for Political Innovation. And when we get together, it's epic. Chanting, music, speeches, commentary, debate, discussion. It's epic when we get together. So we're hoping that we can have more meetups in the near future. So keep that in mind. Shout out to everybody. And so we're just going to have one of our epic live streams. I've got my pen here, my lovely pen. I'll be writing down your super chats as they come in. So if you want me to talk about something, send me a super chat. I will write it down. I will answer as best I can. On that note, the way we do it, opening remarks followed by roll call, then followed by answering of the super chat questions. So if you have a super chat question, shoot it my way. I'll write it down. and I will answer it in the second half of the show. That's how these things work. So there you go. And if you want to get involved in the community around this channel, you can always just shoot me an email, calebmaupin@gmail.com. That's the best way to reach me. I've connected a lot of other people, not only with myself, but with other people who are part of this. And let's let this good thing grow. There's a very, very good thing that we have here. Let's let this good thing grow. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notifications bell, and we'll jump right on into it. Folks, I thought I might do something a little bit interesting for tonight's stream, which is a lot of people really value me getting on here and kind of explaining things, breaking things down. You know, people, they love during the Q&As, people shoot me a question, explain Marx's definition or Lenin's definition of imperialism, explain this, you know, I mean, people like that. People like it when I get on here and share what it is that I know. Use value versus exchange value. Exchange value. And people like that. And one thing that I have looked into, one thing that I've actually looked into over the years, I have investigated the personalities of various revolutionary leaders from the 20th century, mainly. You know, and that is an aspect of this whole political conversation that a lot of people don't venture into. People will explore the theories of Lenin and Trotsky and Stalin and Mao and Fidel Castro and Ho Chi Minh. But the personalities of these individuals, is very telling. Right? If you can understand who it was that these people were, what they were actually like, you know, in terms of human beings, how they interacted with other people, their life story and their history and how they related to other people and how they came to be the leaders of revolutionary movements, that can be very, very valuable information. And a lot of times, what it is that you discover about these individuals does not fit what you thought you knew. Right? And in a lot of cases, you know, there's a huge effort to try and build kind of a pseudo personality. And you know, people would say, "Oh, Caleb, you're saying that, you know, it's propaganda, it's all lie." No, that political movements, for their own reasons, will often build up individual figures. Right? Every presidential campaign, you know, in the United States, you know, Donald Trump, Joe Biden, you know, Kamala Harris, John Kerry, George W. They're all little mini personality cults, right? I mean, they really try to build up this individual as the savior of the country, et cetera, the best choice we have for commander-in-chief. And a lot of times the image that we get of these leaders is not an honest one. It's often not, you know, a very, very honest image. It's what they think is very marketable, what people will vote for, what people will support, what will move people emotionally. There's a reason for that, because when people take on the role of being the leader of a mass political movement, it stops really being about them. It starts being about their mass movement. And their mass political movement may need them to be something other than what they actually are. You know, and there are some weird examples of this. I remember the first presidential election that I was acutely tuned into in the United States I was in high school, and I remember the election of George W. Bush versus John Kerry, right? John Kerry, the senator from Massachusetts, and George W. Bush, the president who led us into the war in Iraq. You know, they were running against each other. George W. Bush won the election. John Kerry lost. Some people think it might have been a stolen election. There's no way to confirm that. But anyway, I do remember that John Kerry, you know, his campaign was very much a military campaign. And it was very, very odd because many, many, many people were voting for John Kerry because they were against the war. George W. Bush invaded Iraq, something that was wildly unpopular throughout the world and wildly unpopular among many sections of the U.S. public. And, George W. Bush was associated with the Patriot Act and the War on Terror and tapping people's phones and all kinds of repression. And he was associated with the Christian religious right. And so based on that, all kinds of people were voting for John Kerry because he was against the war. However, John Kerry's campaign was all about the fact that he was a war hero. It was all about the fact that he was a war hero. John Kerry actually began his acceptance speech at the Democratic National Convention, I kid you not, going, "I'm John Kerry, reporting for duty." It was weird. It was weird because so many of the people voting for him wanted to vote for him because they were mad that George W. Bush had started a war, and they were hoping that he would end the war in Iraq. And on top of that, John Kerry himself had been an anti-war activist. In fact, that's really what John Kerry was famous for. John Kerry testified before Congress and gave an anti-war speech. He was a Vietnam veteran. He fought in Vietnam. And he actually came back from the war, and he started an anti-war activist group called Vietnam Veterans Against the War, VVAW. He started an anti-war group, and he testified before Congress, giving an anti-war speech. And he took his medals, and he threw them over the White House fence in protest. So John Kerry was an anti-war activist. He was running against a president who was somewhat unpopular for starting a war. People were going to vote for him because he was against this guy who had started a war. But John Kerry's whole campaign, they made this documentary about how he'd been a war hero in Vietnam. He began, "I'm John Kerry, reporting for duty." And it was awful. And it was weird. It was very, very weird because, if you know who John Kerry is, right? I mean, the more we learn about him when he was Secretary of State, he was very much a soft power, win without war kind of guy. He oversaw the Iran nuclear deal. He oversaw the restoration of diplomatic relations between the United States and Cuba. John Kerry, more than a lot of people in the Obama administration, more than a lot of people in the Democratic Party, was kind of more or less Allende's Project Cyber. He was more or less, one of these kind of soft power, old school Cold War liberals, more or less. And that when Hillary Clinton was fired as Secretary of State and replaced with John Kerry, that was very much, the Obama administration expressing kind of fear about what had happened in Libya, fear about what had happened in Syria. And John Kerry was seen as a way of kind of toning down some of the aggressive color revolution destabilization stuff that Hillary Clinton was doing. That was very much what John Kerry was about. So John Kerry himself is not a particularly hawkish kind of guy. I mean, he's a mainstream Democrat who's gone along with a lot of what the Democratic Party does. He's not an anti-imperialist by any means, but as politicians go, he was more or less, not as hawkish. Let me just put it that way. He was reluctant. He was a little bit war reluctant, more than the rest of them. Not that he didn't vote for all kinds of things, not that he wasn't going along with the rest of the Democratic Party. He was more or less war reluctant in comparison to a lot of the big name Democrats. His history, he'd been an anti-war activist after he got back from Vietnam. And on top of that, people were voting for him because he was against the war. So why did John Kerry, his entire campaign, play it up that he was just this super military individual? Well, it shows that John Kerry wasn't really trying to appeal to the U.S. public. That was very much John Kerry's trying to tell the American deep state and the American military-industrial complex that they could trust him. The message of his campaign was that George W. Bush is so fanatical in his warmongering stuff that he's not trustworthy. And John Kerry was saying, look, don't worry, I'm going to make a big deal out of my campaign about how military I am. I'm going to downplay my anti-war activism. I'm going to play up the fact that I was in the Army and that I won Purple Hearts. And he was trying to tell the military-industrial complex of the United States, you can vote for me. I am not a threat to you. That's basically what it was. It was John Kerry trying to reassure the American deep state, the American war lobby, that even though he had this history as an anti-war activist, he was trustworthy. And that shows that, in a lot of times when you hear politicians speak, they're not trying to appeal to the public per se. They are trying to appeal to the donor class. They are trying to appeal to strategic interest groups and businesses, because ultimately, if different business constituencies don't like you and consider you to be a threat, they can remove you. I mean, and that happens. Now, so John Kerry did that, and it blew up in his face. It didn't work, right? Because what did they then do? Right? When you're disingenuous, that creates a weakness. And the thing that won the election in 2004 for George W. Bush was the Swift Boat ads. Do folks remember the Swift Boat ads? Swift Boat Veterans for Truth. And they got a couple guys who had served in the military with John Kerry to get up there and question his record. And they got some other Vietnam veterans to get up there and said he protested the war, he disrespected the truth. And John Kerry had spent the whole campaign telling everybody what a war hero he was, what a warmonger he was, how much he believed in militarism, how much he was not an anti-war activist. He was a military guy reporting for duty. He spent his whole campaign doing that. And so the last couple weeks of the campaign, George W. Bush's campaign, Karl Rove in particular, they sunk this torpedo in there and blew it up with things that were more or less true. They were more or less true. John Kerry did protest the war when he got back. That's how he became a political figure. He was just some guy in the army until he came back and started leading anti-war protests. So, that was disingenuous on his part. Second of all, John Kerry's military service, what he got medals for, is not exactly the most honorable thing. He was on a boat. He was a Swift Boat veteran. And he was riding this boat. He's riding a boat, and and there's, he shot 14, 15-year-old kids who were trying to defend their homeland from U.S. imperialism, and he was on a boat and they were on the land, and they'd see some Vietnamese kid who'd be part of the National Liberation Front, 12, 13 years old, boom. Is that heroic? Is that patriotic? Is that some great act of bravery, shooting teenagers who want, the occupier to go home and want to reunite their country? Of course not, right? And so John Kerry playing up that he was this amazing hero because he rowed a boat and shot at teenagers, and then on top of that, him trying to act like he's this pro-military guy when in reality, he was actually, an anti-war activist. It's really wild. A lot of people don't know this, right? And it was mentioned a little bit during the 2004 campaign. We got other stuff to talk about, so I'll move on from this point in a little bit. But I just can't get over this. So the group that John Kerry started, Vietnam Veterans Against the War, VVAW, right? There were other groups of soldiers who were against the war, right? There were, many anti-war rallies during the Vietnam War era had speakers who were anti-war active, who were former soldiers, right? There was something called the American Servicemen's Union, ASU, that was connected to the Workers' World Party. It was started by a guy named Andy Stapp. He had an obituary, in the New York Times when he died. He was a member of the Workers' World Party who started the American Servicemen's Union. VVAW, it tended to be officers, like people who had gone to Harvard or Yale, or people who had gone to the elite military academies, West Point and such. It was a little more wealthier. And hilariously, after the first year that VVAW got going, Vietnam Veterans Against the War, after the first year of VVAW, it became dominated by the Revolutionary Communist Party. Did you know that? The RCP, the Bobovakian people, actually became the main political tendency in the VVAW. VVAW became dominated by Maoist communists. And so much so that in 1978-79, when the Revolutionary Communist Party split, the VVAW also split, and there were two Vietnam Veterans Against the War groups. One was the group that had been around the people who quit the RCP in 1979, and the other was controlled by the RCP. So for a while, there was VVAW, which was led by the people who quit the RCP, and then Bob Avakian's people, they had VVAW-AI, which stood for Vietnam Veterans Against the War, Anti-Imperialist. It was crazy, and for a while the RCP, they had their own VVAW with their own magazine. I think it was called Storm Warning or something like that. So, this group that John Kerry was part of, Vietnam Veterans Against the War, they weren't pacifists. This was kind of a radical anti-imperialist group. It's true that John Kerry was hanging out with Jane Fonda and all that. So when John Kerry, his whole campaign was playing up that he was this military guy, it blew up in his face. It just blew up in his face. It completely blew up in his face. It was an epic political blunder. And, all it took was in the last couple of weeks of the campaign, those Swift Boat Veterans for Truth ads, they sunk John Kerry, sunk him like a torpedo. And on top of that, John Kerry couldn't really get himself straight when it came to issues like abortion and gay marriage, right? He made a big point of being Roman Catholic, and they asked him about abortion and gay marriage. He couldn't give a straight answer, and because he couldn't give a straight answer, because his whole campaign had been based on what a war hero he was, and and that was easily debunked because it wasn't true. John Kerry went down in flames. So it's weird how these things work, but why would John Kerry run his campaign like that? Because he wasn't trying to appeal to the U.S. public. He was trying to appeal to the military-industrial complex. He was trying to make sure that those business interests that were tied to Bush, maybe they had some reservations, that the military-industrial complex, of the United States didn't feel threatened by him. And it didn't work. So it's a little bit wild. It's a little bit wild that, John Kerry, and honestly, John Kerry, he was Secretary of State, and he tried to kind of, to some degree or other, pick up some of the pieces. He was less hawkish than Hillary Clinton was. Hillary Clinton's leadership of the U.S. State Department was an utter nightmare. And the people who put Hillary Clinton in the leadership of the U.S. State Department, those folks have now gathered around Kamala Harris. That's who their new person is, Kamala Harris. And you better believe that Kamala Harris is very, very dangerous. And the fact that she's very, very close to being president right now, there's all these calls now for Joe Biden to resign over Afghanistan. This is a very dangerous situation. I wrote an entire book about Kamala Harris, who she is, her psychological profile and all that. And that's what we're actually going to talk about on here is psychological profiles. That's the point of what I'm talking about tonight in my opening remarks. I'm talking about psychological profiles and the image versus the reality, etc. So when I talk about these various figures from communist history, I'm not talking about the image of who they are. I'm talking about who they really were. And there's a huge gap between those things. One of the greatest examples of a gap is Vladimir Lenin, right? Lenin was the leader of the Bolshevik Party, founder of the Soviet Union. He's in a mausoleum in Red Square in Moscow. That's Vladimir Lenin. And Vladimir Lenin became an iconic saint after his death. He was put in a mausoleum and his body was preserved. His picture was put up everywhere across the Soviet Union. The Soviet Communist Party actually stated that its official ideology was Marxism, Leninism. And Lenin became an icon. And if you read some of the official histories, if you read the history of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, short course, which is a very good book. It's like the official Soviet textbook on the history of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Very good book, short course, History of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, short course. Very good, very informative book. If you read some of the other books that have been published, Trotsky does this too. If you read Trotsky's writings on this, you get the idea that it was a cult, that Lenin was the great leader. And that Lenin, you get this image of this strong, amazing, charismatic man that everyone bowed before and he was amazing and all of that. And Lenin was not that. The more you read about who Vladimir Lenin was, you get a very, very different picture. Very, very different picture of the more you learn about who Vladimir Lenin really was, the more you understand that patron saintage, that cult of personality that was built around Lenin, mainly after he died, that is a misrepresentation of who he was. Vladimir Lenin, first of all, he had a speech impediment. Right? He had a lisp, basically. He had difficulty speaking, an extreme amount of difficulty speaking. And he was quite shy. He had difficulty speaking. He was shy. But he was very, very worked up. And he was very, very obsessive. And probably the event that had the biggest impact on Vladimir Lenin's life was the fact that his older brother was executed. Vladimir Lenin's older brother received the death penalty. I believe Vladimir Lenin was a teenager at the time, if I'm not mistaken. His older brother was a university student, and his older brother had joined the terrorists, which was not a slur. It's what this group in Russia called themselves. There were some revolutionaries in Russia who called themselves the terrorists. And the terrorists had attempted to assassinate one of the czars. I think it was Tsar Alexander III. And Lenin's older brother had tried to kill one of the czars and failed and been caught, and so he was hanged. And so Lenin's older brother got the death penalty. Now, if you can imagine the amount of trauma, you're 14, 15 years old, and your older brother gets executed. You want to talk about an event in your life that is going to be pivotal. I mean, that is huge. Your family dies, someone in your immediate family, one of your siblings, one of your parents die. Always a traumatic experience. But to have that member of your family charged with a crime by the government and formally executed, that has got to be a horrific, traumatizing experience, right? And to think that didn't have an impact on Vladimir Lenin and the course of his life would be an illusion, right? To have your older brother executed is huge. Now, the fact that Lenin was rather shy in his personal interactions, that he had the lisp, he was kind of soft-spoken. At the same time that he was shy and somewhat soft-spoken, Vladimir Lenin was also obsessed. He was obsessed, right? There was one of his critics who was arguing against him, and he said, "How am I supposed to argue with somebody who lives and breathes revolution 24 hours a day?" He was obsessed. He thought about nothing but communism, nothing but revolution. He was obsessed. And when there would be a crisis in the political groups he was working in, he would start to have heart trouble. He would be unable to sleep. He would have a nervous condition where he was just on edge and couldn't focus on anything. He suffered of this, this condition of this chronic stress. He would stress himself out. And in order to calm himself down, he would get so worked up over political divisions and such, he learned to play the piano. Playing the piano was how he calmed himself down. He played the piano. So when you think of Vladimir Lenin, think of a guy with a lisp who's shy, who gets really worked up over political debates, and in order to calm himself down, he forces himself to develop, a hobby, black hammer, to develop a hobby, and that hobby is playing the piano. That's Vladimir Lenin, right? Not the image that you get. That's not, you watch these Sergei Eisenstein films, it's not what you think it is. Now, he was a very good writer, and he forced himself to become a good speaker, despite the fact that he was shy. But ultimately, and this is the important thing, what made Vladimir Lenin effective was not his ability to rally the masses. It was his ability to kind of corral and regroup the revolutionary movement. And again, doesn't fit the image. We see those images of Lenin speaking and he's at a podium. A lot of times those are clips from a Sergei Eisenstein film called October. They're not actually clips of Lenin. But regardless, the fact that Lenin became what he became was because Lenin built the Bolshevik Party. He built the Bolshevik Party, and the Bolsheviks really were a party. It was a party of new type. And it was a party, it was a way to kind of corral and maneuver and effectively bring together the Marxist movement of Russia in order to win. That's really what it was. So in 1903, many of the great revolutionaries in Russia met in London. They met in London. They were Russian revolutionaries, and they had a meeting in London. And this meeting took place in London. And Stalin, I think Stalin was there, Bukharin was there, Zinoviev was there, Kamenev, Trotsky, all of them were there. And Lenin, at this meeting, he pitched to them his idea for a party of new type. A party of new type. He said, if we're going to win, if we're going to effectively overthrow capitalism, overthrow the Tsar, we have to have a new method, a new style of organizing. We need to build a party of new type. And before this meeting happened, he wrote a short essay pitching it called Where to Begin, and then he wrote a full-length book pitching it called What Is to Be Done. And if you read What Is to Be Done, the name What Is to Be Done, it was the name of a popular science fiction novel at the time. There was a science fiction novel in Russia. I think it's about a guy who builds a little civilization in his house or something. It's a weird sci-fi novel. It was really popular at the time. So he took the name of this popular sci-fi novel and he wrote a political essay, basically, called What Is to Be Done, with the same name as the sci-fi novel, to convince people to build a party of new type. And if you read What Is to Be Done, it is a scathing polemic. He's very worked up, and he's basically saying that if we are going to win, in order to win, we have to change the way that we're organizing. And the best advice I ever got, by the way, the best advice anybody ever gave me, is they told me to read What Is to Be Done backwards. The book What Is to Be Done by Vladimir Lenin is a very, very difficult book to read, right? Keep its members principled. Keep members principled. Question mark, keep from deviating. It was actually very good advice. What is to be done? It's written like this. He starts out with a very, very specific argument, the concept of freedom of criticism. And then from there, he expands to the question of bowing to spontaneity. And from there, he expands the question of terror. And the final section is he goes over the entire history of the Russian revolutionary movement. So the thing is, when you're reading the book well over 100 years later, in another country, in another language, starting with this very specific argument and expanding outward is not a good way to start. So if you really want to get a lot out of the book, What Is to Be Done by Lenin, the best advice I ever got is to start at the end. Start at the end. Start with the final chapter. And then read the previous chapter. And then read the previous chapter. And then read the previous chapter. And then read the first chapter. That's the best way to read it. That way you get the message of the book. Because when it starts out, I'll tell you, the first time I ever read What Is to Be Done, very funny story. So I think I was in junior high, right? I wasn't even in high school yet. And I was reading the encyclopedia entry about Lenin. And it said, and then in 1903, Lenin wrote his very, very, very important book, What Is to Be Done? And I thought, wow, what a name, What Is to Be Done? And I thought this was some kind of agitational pamphlet about how to overthrow the Tsar or something like that. So I went to the library and I ordered a copy of What Is to Be Done. And I started reading it, and I had no clue what they were talking about. Raboche, DeLeo, and he's ranting against this concept of freedom of criticism. I'm like, what is freedom of criticism? Is he against freedom of speech? Does he think people shouldn't be able to free to criticize? I had no idea what he was talking about. And it took me years before I reopened What Is to Be Done by Lenin, because I couldn't make heads or tails of it. So many references to newspapers with Russian names that I had never heard of. So many references to people like Kautsky or Bernstein I'd never heard of. References to the Second International, which I had no idea what he was talking about. I didn't reopen What Is to Be Done until I was 19, until I was doing communist political activism. And the group I was associating with at the time was trying to convince me that we needed to have a campaign to impeach President George W. Bush. And I didn't understand why, all right, she adjusting. I didn't understand why that was necessary. So they said, oh, well, you got to read What Is to Be Done. So I remember I went and read What Is to Be Done, and I read it with them. And reading it in a group, it was a class. I didn't just read it on my own, but I read it with 4 or 5 other communists. And that was a huge eye-opening experience for me. I'd never read